You already know you're not a monster, and that's exactly what I want to examine. Not to challenge your character, not to suggest you're hiding something dark, but because that certainty, the quiet confidence that you know which side of the line you're on, is the specific thing Hannah Arendt spent the last years of her life thinking about. And what she found is more unsettling than anything you'll hear from a pulpit or a pundit. Not because it accuses you, because it refuses to let you off with the accusation. There's a phrase you've almost certainly heard, the banality of evil. And I want to tell you what most people think it means. Because getting that wrong means missing the most important thing Arendt ever said. Version 1. Evil is ordinary. It's everywhere. The worst things in history were done by average people, which means average people are dangerous, which means, what exactly? Watch your neighbor, distrust the crowd. That reading leaves you with anxiety and nothing to do with it. Version 2. The Holocaust happened because of systems and institutions. The machinery of the state, the bureaucratic logic, the industrial efficiency. That's what made it possible. This reading is popular in certain academic and political circles, and it's not entirely wrong, but it quietly removes the human being from the center of the picture. The system did it, which is another way of saying, nobody did it. Version 3, and this is the one that most troubles people when they hear it. Eichmann was just following orders, which sounds like it lets him off the hook, which is why so many people, when they first encountered Arendt's book in 1963, were furious with her. They thought she was making an excuse. She was not making an excuse. She was doing something far more disturbing. In April of 1961, Hannah Arendt traveled to Jerusalem to cover the trial of Adolf Eichmann for The New Yorker. She sat across a glass partition from him for months. She watched him testify. She listened to him explain himself. And what she encountered was not what she expected. Not what anyone expected. Eichmann was not a sadist. He was not a fanatic. He had not spent his life consumed by hatred. He was, by every observable measure, a bureaucrat. A careful, thorough, professionally ambitious bureaucrat who had found, in the machinery of the Nazi state, a career structure that rewarded competence and punished deviation. He organized train schedules. He managed logistics. He coordinated the movement of human beings from one place to another with the efficiency of a man who took his work seriously. What struck Arendt, what she couldn't shake, was his language. When he spoke about what he had done, he spoke in cliches, official phrases, administrative formulations. He was not covering anything up. He appeared to genuinely have no other language available. He had, over years, replaced his own voice with the voice of the institution. And in doing so, he had replaced his own conscience with the institution's logic. This is what she meant by thoughtlessness, not stupidity. Eichmann was not stupid. He was, in a technical sense, quite capable. What he had lost, or more precisely, what he had allowed to atrophy, was the habit of thinking morally. The internal conversation that asks, is this right? Not, is this efficient? Not, is this what I'm supposed to do? Not, is this what everyone around me is doing? But the harder, slower, lonelier question, is this right? She wrote, in the final lines of Eichmann in Jerusalem, that the trouble with Eichmann was precisely that so many were like him, and that the many were neither perverted nor sadistic, that they were, and still are, terribly and terrifyingly normal. Terribly and terrifyingly normal. That sentence made people furious in 1963. It still does. Because if you read it as, most people are like Eichmann, it sounds like an accusation with no exit. It sounds like she's saying evil is inevitable, that the line between perpetrator and bystander is just circumstance, that none of us can be trusted. That is not what she meant. But getting to what she meant requires a second step, and the second step is where this gets personal. In her later work, particularly in The Life of the Mind, the book she was writing when she died, in 1975, mid-sentence, at her typewriter, Arendt developed what the Eichmann observation actually pointed toward. She argued that thinking, in the specifically moral sense, is something like a faculty. Not intelligence, not education, not sophistication. A practice, the practice of the internal dialogue, what she called, following Socrates, the two-in-one, the self in conversation with itself. When you ask yourself, from inside your own conscience, whether what you're doing is right, not whether it's legal, not whether it's expected, not whether your tribe approves, you are exercising a faculty, and like any faculty, it can be exercised or neglected, strengthened or allowed to weaken. Eichmann had allowed it to weaken, not all at once. not through a dramatic decision to become evil. Gradually, over years, by substituting the institution's answers for his own, by letting the role absorb the person, by finding it easier and professionally safer to stop asking the question that the institution couldn't answer for him. The question she asked, sitting across that glass partition, was not, "How did this man become a monster?" The question she asked was, "What happened to his thinking?" And the answer she found, demonstrated across that entire trial, in every exchange, in every cliché-filled response, was that nothing dramatic had happened to it. It had simply stopped, quietly, incrementally, without a rupture or a revelation. He had stopped exercising the thing that would have made him say no. This is where I need to stop and tell you about something that happened on the other side of the world while Arendt was sitting in that courtroom. In 1961 at Yale University, a psychologist named Stanley Milgram began designing an experiment. He was motivated explicitly by the Eichmann trial. He wanted to know whether what Arendt was observing was specific to a certain culture, a certain historical moment, a certain kind of person, or whether it was something else, something more general. His experiment was simple. Subjects were brought into a laboratory and told they were participating in a study of memory and learning. They were assigned the role of teacher. In the next room, separated by a thin wall, there was a learner, actually an actor, who was strapped to what appeared to be an electric shock apparatus. The teacher was instructed to administer increasingly powerful shocks each time the learner answered incorrectly. The shocks weren't real. The pain was performed, but the subjects didn't know that. At 75 volts, the learner began to grunt. At 120, to complain of pain. At 150, to demand to be released. At 285, there was only silence, and the voltage levels continued to go up, past extreme danger, all the way to 450 volts. When subjects hesitated, the experimenter, calm, authoritative in a gray lab coat, simply said, "Please continue," or "The experiment requires that you continue." Nothing more. 65% of the subjects administered the maximum shock. Not 65% of some special population. Not 65% of people who had been selected for aggression or obedience or lack of empathy. 65% of ordinary Americans recruited off the street in New Haven, Connecticut in 1962. People with jobs and families and, presumably, a clear sense of themselves as decent. Milgram published his findings in 1963, the same year Arendt's book appeared. He cited her work directly. He had designed the experiment to test her hypothesis, and the experiment confirmed it. In ordinary people, in ordinary circumstances, with nothing more than an authority figure and an institutional frame, the thinking function could be bypassed. Not because the subjects were secretly evil, because the mechanism Arendt described, the substitution of institutional logic for personal conscience, was not a German mechanism, it was a human one. And here is the piece that I find the most difficult to sit with, because it removes the last comfortable exit. In 1992, historian Christopher Browning published a book called Ordinary Men. He studied Reserve Police Battalion 101, a unit of middle-aged German men, not SS ideologues, not specially selected for brutality, not even particularly committed Nazis, who became mass murderers and occupied Poland during the Second World War. They shot more than 38,000 Jews in a series of operations beginning in 1942. What Browning found in the documentary record was this. Before the first major operation, their commander, Major Trapp, told them explicitly that if any of them did not feel up to the task, they could step out. They would not be punished. They would be reassigned. About 12 men, out of nearly 500, stepped out. The rest participated. They were not coerced. They were offered the option. And they chose, through whatever combination of peer pressure and role identity and the desire not to stand apart from the group, to continue. Browning documents this not to condemn them across 60 years. He is careful about that, but to establish with historical precision what Arendt had argued philosophically, that in most of those cases, thinking the Arendt kind, the Socratic kind, the kind that asks, "Is this right?" from inside one's own conscience, had ceased to be the operative faculty. Something else was driving the decision. And the something else was not monstrous, it was ordinary. The 12 men who stepped out were not, as far as anyone can determine, morally exceptional. They were not saints. They were people in whom, for whatever reason, the thinking function had not been fully suspended. People who, at the decisive moment, asked the question and let their own conscience answer it. If you want to go further with what Arendt was actually arguing, the precise formulations in her own words, there's something in the description I think you'll find worth your time. It's a collection of 50 of her most concentrated passages, each with a plain English commentary that gets at what she meant and why it still applies. Not a course, not an assignment, just her words, organized by theme, available for the kind of slow, personal engagement she was always describing. It's in the description, and it costs less than a hardcover. Now, here is where everything I've told you comes back to you personally. At some point in this video, you may have felt a quiet resistance, a kind of, yes, but I would have been one of the 12. Most of us feel that. It is, in its way, the necessary starting point. You need to believe you're capable of moral choice before you can take the question seriously. But here is what I want you to notice about that feeling. It is not an answer. It is a self-report. And self-reports about moral behavior, as Milgram's subjects demonstrated in New Haven in 1962, are the least reliable data we have. Before the experiment, when Milgram described its design to groups of psychiatrists, he asked them to predict how many subjects would go to maximum voltage. Their average prediction was 1 to 2%. The people with clearly diagnosable pathologies, the actual number was 65%. The psychiatrists were not wrong about human nature in the abstract. They were wrong about the specific conditions under which human nature fails, which is exactly the conditions Arendt was describing. So the question is not, would I have been one of the 12? The question is something harder and more immediate. What are the conditions in your own life? In your institution, your community, your political tribe, your church, your family, where institutional logic is most likely to replace your own thinking, where the cliches of your group have begun to substitute for the harder, slower, lonelier work of asking the question yourself. That is the question Arendt left behind. Not, are you a good person? Not, are you capable of evil? But, are you still thinking? Here is the thing about Arendt herself that I find most useful in answering that question. And it has nothing to do with philosophy. When her book was published in 1963, the backlash was immediate and severe. She was accused by prominent members of the Jewish community of having no love for her own people. She was accused of exonerating Eichmann. She was accused of blaming Jewish leaders for their cooperation with the deportations. The philosopher Gershom Scholem wrote her a letter accusing her of a lack of Ahabath Israel, love of the Jewish people. She was disinvited from institutions, dropped by colleagues she had known for decades, publicly denounced by people she had considered friends. Her response to Scholem is one of the most precise things she ever wrote. She told him that she had never in her life loved any people or collective, that the only love she knew how to mean was the love of persons. That abstractions, the Jewish people, the German people, America, were not the proper objects of love, and that she was not willing to let her love of any abstraction prevent her from thinking clearly about what had actually happened. She kept writing, she kept thinking. The life of the mind was never finished. She died before she could complete it, but what she was working toward, right up to the end, was a full philosophical account of what she had observed in Eichmann. That thinking is not merely a cognitive activity. It is the moral faculty, the thing that produces, as she put it in her 1971 essay, the capacity to say, I cannot do this. Not, I am forbidden. Not, I will be punished. Not, this is against the rules. But, I, this specific I, in conversation with itself, cannot do this. That sentence is only available to a person who is still thinking. In 1933, Hannah Arendt left Germany with almost nothing. She spent years stateless, in France, in a refugee camp, finally in New York, with no English and almost no money. She built her entire intellectual life in a second language, in a country she had not chosen, writing about ideas that most people found threatening or incomprehensible or both. She was wrong about some things. She was controversial about nearly everything. She discomforted every group that tried to recruit her. The left found her too skeptical of revolutionary politics. The right found her too critical of nationalism. Her own community in 1963 found her too honest about what she had seen. What she never did was stop thinking, not when it was professionally costly, not when it lost her friends, not when the institution, any institution, offered her the easier path of the cliché, the received answer, the group formulation, she thought. And she paid for it. And she thought anyway. The question she leaves us with is not about Eichmann. It was never really about Eichmann. It is about the specific way that ordinary people, in ordinary circumstances, with no dramatic rupture and no descent into obvious darkness, lose the practice that makes moral life possible. The protection she describes is not virtue. It is not belief. It is not belonging to the right community or holding the right values or having been raised correctly. It is a practice, a habit, a discipline as ordinary and as demanding as exercise, which means it can be neglected and it can be recovered. And the question is not whether you have it, but whether you are doing it. Dark times, she understood, are precisely the times when the habit is most under pressure. When the institution is loudest, when the tribe is most insistent, when the cliché is most available and the silence of real thought most uncomfortable, those are the times. Not when you are at your worst, but when you are at your most ordinary, when the question matters most. Are you still thinking? If you've ever been in a room where everyone agreed, your family, your church, your political community, and you felt a question rising in you that you didn't quite say out loud, tell me, what was the question? I'd like to know what you were holding. Dark times call for clear minds,